Daniel Carter adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored suit, his eyes scanning the bustling streets of Manhattan. Another high-stakes business meeting was in the books. Another deal closed. Life as a billionaire had its perks: fame, fortune, power, but it came with a cost. He thought he had everything, but lately something was missing, something that money couldn't buy. As he strolled toward his car, his driver already waiting, something caught his eye. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, a woman sat on the sidewalk, a cardboard sign clutched in her hands. "Hungry, please help." It wasn't uncommon to see people begging in the city, but something about this woman made him stop in his tracks. Her hair was matted, her clothes tattered, but when their eyes met, Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He knew those eyes. No, it couldn't be. Daniel's mind raced back 20 years, to a time when life was simpler, back when he was just an awkward high school kid with a crush. Emily Greene, the girl who never noticed him, the girl who was always just out of reach. And here she was, begging for food. He could feel his breath hitch as he stood frozen on the busy street, the world moving around him in a blur. How had her life taken such a turn? What had happened to her? His feet moved before he could think, taking him closer to her. Each step felt heavier than the last, memories of his teenage years flooding his mind. He had admired her from afar for so long, never gathering the courage to speak to her. And now, after all these years, their paths had crossed again in the most unexpected of ways. "Emily?" His voice cracked as the word escaped his lips. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes hollow and lost. For a moment, there was no recognition, but then her expression shifted. Her eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. "Daniel!" She barely whispered his name, but it was enough to send a shockwave through him. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of something much more complicated, something neither of them was prepared for. Daniel stood frozen in front of Emily, unable to speak for a moment. His heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of memories. The sound of the busy New York street faded, and he was transported back to a time when life was simpler, yet more painful in many ways. Daniel was the quiet, awkward kid in the back of the classroom, always with his nose in a book. He wasn't unpopular, just invisible, especially to the people who mattered. And no one mattered more to him than Emily Greene. She was everything he wasn't: outgoing, popular, and effortlessly beautiful. With her golden hair and easy smile, she drew people to her like a magnet. Daniel would watch her from a distance, heart pounding every time she laughed, every time she walked past him in the hallway. He was just another face in the crowd to her. She was dating the school's football star, Mark Reynolds, and Daniel had no chance. He knew it. Everyone knew it. But there was that one moment, the moment he always replayed in his mind, the what if that haunted him. It was junior year, and he had stayed late after school, working on a project in the library. It was pouring rain outside, and when he finally packed up to leave, he saw her, Emily, standing at the front doors, staring at the rain. Her ride hadn't shown up. Daniel had his mom's old car, and for the first time he saw an opportunity to actually talk to her. His heart raced as he approached her, his hands clammy as he offered her a ride. "Hey, Emily, you need a lift?" She turned and looked at him, her eyes soft but surprised. For a moment he thought she might actually say yes. His heart leaped into his throat. But then, Mark's car pulled up, headlights cutting through the rain. Emily's face lit up, and just like that, Daniel faded into the background again. "Thanks, but I'm good," she said with a polite smile before running off to join Mark. He watched them drive away, the opportunity slipping through his fingers. He never got another chance. The memory hit Daniel hard. He hadn't thought about that moment in years, but seeing Emily like this brought everything back. She was staring at him now, eyes wide with disbelief. The years hadn't been kind to her. Her once bright hair was now dull and matted, her face gaunt and hollow. But those eyes. Those same blue eyes he had fallen for back in high school were still there, filled with pain and confusion. "Emily, what happened to you?" The question spilled from his lips before he could stop it. Emily's gaze dropped, shame flickering across her face. She quickly looked away, pulling her coat tighter around herself as if to hide from him. It's complicated," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel knelt beside her, his business suit feeling out of place in this moment. He didn't care. He wasn't the billionaire anymore, he was just a guy trying to help someone he once cared about. "Let me help you," he said softly. Emily shook her head, her hands trembling as she held her cardboard sign. "I don't need your help, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Daniel wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between the girl he remembered and the woman sitting in front of him, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away. As Daniel looked into Emily's eyes, a determination settled over him. He wasn't going to make the same mistake he had made in high school. He wasn't going to walk away this time. "I'm not leaving until I help you," Daniel said, his voice steady, his gaze locked on hers. Emily looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Daniel didn't understand what she meant, but one thing was clear. There was more to Emily's story than he realized. And, as he stood up, ready to take the first step in helping her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this reunion was about to take him down a path he wasn't prepared for. The next morning, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Her words from the day before echoed in his mind. "You shouldn't have come back." What had she meant by that? He had given her some money for food, but it didn't feel like enough. After years of building his empire, he knew that throwing money at a problem didn't fix it. He wanted to do more, but he didn't know where to start. Emily had disappeared into the streets shortly after they talked, and Daniel hadn't been able to find her again. The city was too big, too crowded. He couldn't shake the gnawing guilt in his gut. He had everything, and she had nothing. As he sat in his office, staring out over the Manhattan skyline, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Carter, there's a woman here to see you." Daniel turned, surprised. "Who is it?" "She says her name is Emily Greene." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Emily had come to him. What did she want? Was she ready to accept his help? Or was there something more to her sudden appearance? Emily walked into his office, her eyes scanning the lavish room. She looked out of place, but there was a quiet dignity about her that hadn't been there the day before. "I shouldn't have come," she said quickly, her voice full of regret. "But I didn't know where else to go." Daniel stood up, crossing the room to her. "I'm glad you did." Emily looked at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I need help, Daniel. But it's not the kind of help you think." Daniel frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm in trouble," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if you get involved, it could ruin everything for you." The weight of her words hung in the air. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He was about to step into something dangerous, something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. Emily sat across from Daniel, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid someone might overhear them. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and Daniel could sense the fear radiating off of her. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" Daniel asked, his voice calm, though his heart was racing. Emily hesitated, biting her lip as if weighing whether or not to trust him. "Years ago, I got involved with someone," she started, her voice shaky. "A powerful man. At first, he seemed like he wanted to help me, but it turned into something else, something darker." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Who is he?" Emily shook her head. "I can't say. If I do, it'll put you in danger." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "I don't care about the danger, Emily. I care about you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time Daniel saw the full weight of her burden. She wasn't just struggling with homelessness. She was running from someone who had the power to destroy her. And now, Daniel had stepped into the crossfire. As Daniel stared at her, he realized that helping Emily would cost him more than he had anticipated. But for the first time in years, he felt a purpose beyond his wealth and success. He wasn't going to turn back now. The weight of Emily's words hung in the air. Daniel felt as if the room had grown smaller, the walls closing in on him as the reality of her situation settled over him. She was in danger, real danger, and now, by extension, so was he. He had faced high-stakes deals, massive financial risks, and competitors who would do anything to bring him down. But this was different. This was personal. "You don't have to protect me, Emily. Tell me who he is," Daniel pressed, his voice steady but full of concern. Emily shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "I can't. You don't understand what he's capable of, Daniel. He has connections, people who can make things disappear, people who can make you disappear." Daniel's mind raced. He had built an empire from the ground up, but he had never faced a challenge like this. He wasn't naive, he knew the world had darker corners, even in the boardroom, but now he was up against a man with no ethics, no rules. "You came to me for a reason," Daniel said softly. "I want to help you, but I can't do that if I don't know what we're up against." Emily looked away, the conflict tearing her apart. Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mark Reynolds." Daniel's heart stopped. Mark Reynolds. The name echoed in his mind, dragging him back to high school again, where Mark had been the golden boy, the star athlete, and the guy who had always been just out of Daniel's reach. The same Mark Reynolds who had stolen Emily's heart all those years ago. But this wasn't high school anymore, and Mark Reynolds wasn't just the quarterback of the football team now. He was powerful, connected, and dangerous. "I didn't realize it at first," Emily continued, her eyes brimming with regret. "After we broke up in college, I moved on with my life, or at least I tried to. But Mark, he became obsessed. He didn't like the idea of me leaving him behind. When I found out what kind of people he was involved with, it was too late. I tried to get away from him, but every time I thought I was free, he pulled me back in." Daniel stared at her, his jaw clenched. "And now you're running from him?" Emily nodded. "I've been running for years, but no matter where I go, he always finds me. I'm not just some homeless woman on the street, Daniel. I'm his property, and he's not going to let me go." The revelation hit Daniel like a ton of bricks. The woman he had loved from afar for so many years was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't have imagined. And now, standing between her and the man who had destroyed her life, Daniel realized he was facing more than just a fight for Emily's safety. He was fighting for her freedom. As Daniel stood in his office, staring at Emily, a new sense of resolve hardened inside him. He wasn't going to let Mark Reynolds win. Not this time. He had the resources, the connections, and the determination to take him down. But what Daniel didn't know was that Mark was already watching, and he was ready for a fight. Daniel spent the next few days working furiously behind the scenes. He had called in favors, hired investigators, and quietly begun gathering information on Mark Reynolds. It didn't take long to uncover the web of shady deals, illegal operations, and under-the-table transactions that Mark had built his empire on. But it was more than just business. It was personal. Daniel's gut churned as he scrolled through pages of intel his team had gathered. Mark had connections in politics, law enforcement, and even organized crime. He wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. And yet, Emily had been part of his life for years, trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. "We're going to take him down," Daniel said firmly, turning to his head of security. Gavin, a former military man who had been by his side for years. Gavin raised an eyebrow. "It won't be easy. Reynolds has his hands in everything. He's not going to go down without a fight." "I don't care how hard it is," Daniel snapped. "We're going to destroy him piece by piece until there's nothing left." Daniel's anger simmered beneath the surface, but it was more than that. It was personal. For too long, Mark Reynolds had tormented Emily, and Daniel was finally in a position to do something about it. But what he didn't anticipate was just how far Mark was willing to go to keep his secrets buried. As Daniel walked out of the office that night, his phone buzzed. It was a message, an unknown number. He opened it and froze. "Back off, Carter, or she pays the price." Mark Reynolds had made his move. Daniel gripped his phone, his pulse racing. The message was a warning, but he knew it wouldn't stop there. Mark Reynolds wasn't the type to issue empty threats. He had Emily in his sights, and now Daniel was a target too. But instead of fear, Daniel felt a surge of anger. He wasn't going to let Mark intimidate him. He had fought too hard to build his empire, and now he had something even more important to fight for: Emily's freedom. He dialed Gavin's number. "We need to meet. Tonight." The plan was in motion. Daniel wasn't going to wait for Mark to strike again. He was going to take the fight to him. But what he didn't expect was that Mark was already 2 steps ahead. That evening, Daniel met Gavin in a private office. Blueprints, documents, and surveillance photos of Mark's operations were spread across the table. It was a map of everything Mark had built and how they were going to tear it down. "We have the element of surprise," Gavin said, tapping on one of the documents. "Mark's not expecting you to fight back this hard." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Good, because when I'm done with him, he won't have anything left." Just as they finalized their plan, the building's security alarm blared. Gavin and Daniel rushed to the monitors, their hearts pounding. The cameras showed a group of men, Mark's men, surrounding the building. The message was clear. Mark wasn't waiting anymore. Daniel's heart raced as he stared at the monitors. Mark's men were moving in quickly, their intentions clear. This wasn't just a warning, it was an attack. "We need to get out of here," Gavin said, already moving to secure an escape route. "They're not here to talk." Daniel grabbed his phone, dialing Emily. She answered on the second ring, her voice trembling. "Daniel, what's happening?" "Stay where you are," Daniel ordered. "I'm sending someone to get you. Don't go anywhere." As Gavin secured the building, Daniel's mind raced. Mark wasn't playing games anymore. The trap was closing in on them, and time was running out. But as they prepared to escape, Daniel realized that the only way to win was to turn the trap on Mark. They made it out of the building just before Mark's men breached the doors. Daniel had anticipated an attack, but not this quickly. He had to think fast. As Gavin drove them away, Daniel formulated a new plan, one that would force Mark's hand and bring him down once and for all. "We're going to set a trap of our own," Daniel said, his voice filled with determination. "And this time, we're going to make sure Mark can't escape." The trap was set. Mark had made the first move, but Daniel was about to make the last one. The battle was far from over, and the final confrontation was looming. It was a rainy night when Daniel and Gavin made their way to the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. This was where Mark Reynolds operated his most dangerous business dealings, the heart of his empire. And tonight, it would be the place where Daniel ended it all. Emily had begged Daniel not to go, not to risk everything for her, but he couldn't walk away now. Mark had pushed too far, and it was time to finish what he had started. As they approached the warehouse, the tension in the air was palpable. Daniel knew that once he stepped inside, there would be no turning back. But this wasn't just about taking down Mark, it was about saving Emily from a life of fear and control. The final showdown began with a firefight. Mark's men were heavily armed, but Daniel had the advantage of surprise. Gavin led the tactical team, neutralizing Mark's guards one by one. As the gunfire echoed through the warehouse, Daniel made his way deeper inside, his heart pounding with every step. He knew where Mark would be, the office at the back of the building, where he conducted his most illegal deals. Daniel kicked open the door, his eyes locking on Mark, who stood behind his desk, a cold smile on his face. "You really think you can stop me?" Mark sneered. "You're just a businessman, Carter. You don't have what it takes to bring me down." Daniel's grip tightened on his gun. "I don't have to. You've already done it yourself." The room was filled with tension as the final confrontation unfolded. Mark reached for his weapon, but Daniel was faster. With a single shot, it was over. Mark's body crumpled to the floor, the cold smile wiped from his face, replaced by a look of shock. For a brief moment, silence fell over the warehouse, the only sound the faint drip of rain leaking through the cracked roof. Daniel stood frozen, the gun still in his hand. He wasn't a killer, but this was survival. Survival for him, for Emily, and for everyone whose lives Mark had destroyed. He stepped closer to Mark's fallen figure, his mind racing. processing what had just happened. It was over. After all the tension, after all the fear and danger, the man who had haunted Emily's life for years was finally gone. Gavin burst through the door, his eyes darting between Daniel and Mark's body on the ground. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Daniel nodded, lowering the gun. "Yeah, it's done." Gavin glanced down at Mark and gave a short nod. "I'll clean this up. You need to get back to Emily." Daniel's pulse was still racing as he left the warehouse, but a strange sense of calm began to settle over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. He had freed Emily from the nightmare, but he didn't know if it was enough to truly bring her peace, or if they had a future together. As the rain poured down, Daniel dialed Emily's number. She answered almost immediately, her voice shaky. "Daniel, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, his voice softening at the sound of her voice. "It's over, Emily. Mark's gone." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment, and then Emily's quiet sobs filled the air. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "I'm coming to see you. Just stay where you are." As Daniel hung up the phone, he knew this wasn't just about Mark anymore. He had feelings for Emily, strong feelings. And now that Mark was out of the picture, he needed to know if there was a future for them together. It was time to see if their past could lead to something real in the present. The rain had stopped by the time Daniel arrived at Emily's temporary apartment. He stood outside the door for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had fought for her, risked everything for her. Now, it was time to see if that fight would lead them to the place they were meant to be. He knocked lightly, and a few moments later, the door creaked open. Emily stood there, her eyes red from crying, but there was a softness in her expression, an openness that Daniel hadn't seen before. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. She nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was small and simple, but it was safe. It wasn't the street, and it wasn't the nightmare she had lived through with Mark. This was her space, a place where she could finally begin to heal. Daniel turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "How are you feeling?" Emily wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from the emotions flooding her. "I don't know. It feels strange. Like I should be happy, but I don't know how to be." Daniel took a step closer, his heart aching for her. "You've been through hell, Emily. It's going to take time. But you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why, Daniel? Why did you do all of this for me? You could have walked away." He smiled softly, shaking his head. "I couldn't walk away. Not from you." Emily blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't understand. After everything I've been through, after everything you've done for me, I don't know how I can ever repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "I did it because I care about you, Emily. I've always cared about you. Even back in high school, when I was too shy to say anything, you were the one person I couldn't forget." Emily's eyes widened at his confession, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. Could it be true? Could Daniel, the boy who had admired her from afar all those years ago, have been the one constant in her life through everything? As Daniel stepped closer, Emily felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. She had spent years running, afraid, ashamed, but now, for the first time, she felt safe. Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long feeling broken, feeling like she didn't deserve happiness. But now, standing in front of Daniel, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had a second chance. "I didn't think anyone would care about me like this," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I didn't think anyone would want to be with someone as damaged as me." Daniel's eyes softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "You're not damaged, Emily. You're strong. You survived things that most people couldn't. And I don't care about your past. I care about who you are right now." Emily's breath hitched as she stared into his eyes. There was no pity there, no judgment, only compassion, understanding, and something she hadn't seen in a long time. Love. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do anything," Daniel replied, his voice low and tender. "Just let me in. Let me be part of your life." For the first time in years, Emily felt her walls start to crumble. The fear, the shame, the doubt, it all started to melt away as she stood there with Daniel. She had spent so long running, but maybe now she didn't have to run anymore. As the distance between them closed, Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek. This was real. This was something she never thought she'd have. A chance to start over, a chance to be loved. Daniel leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead in a tender kiss. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Emily. We can start over. Together." The rain had stopped completely, leaving the air fresh and cool. As the first rays of dawn peeked through the window, Emily and Daniel sat together on the small couch, the weight of the past lifting from their shoulders. They didn't need to say much. The silence between them was comforting, a mutual understanding that they had both been through their own battles, and now they were ready to face the future, together. "I don't know what happens next," Emily admitted softly, her hand resting in Daniel's. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm not scared of it." Daniel smiled, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Just as they were beginning to settle into this new reality, Daniel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message, from an unknown number. He picked it up, frowning as he read the text. "This isn't over. You'll regret crossing me." Daniel's heart raced, but this time it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was determination. He turned to Emily, his expression serious but calm. "Whatever happens, we'll be ready." Emily smiled softly, leaning into him as she whispered, "I'm not running anymore, Daniel. Not from him, not from you, not from us." With that, she kissed him, a kiss that was filled with promise, hope, and the strength to face whatever came next. Together, they would conquer the ghosts of their past and build a future neither of them had thought possible. As their story begins a new chapter, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories that will keep you hooked until the very end. Leave a comment if you were touched by Emily and Daniel's journey, and don't miss the next installment. There's always more to the story.